Hello, we are here today to talk to Anne Haralambie, coming to us from New Hampshire. Welcome, Anne. We had several reschedules, so we are finally
Mainly.
able to talk to you. Welcome.
Well,
Yes. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you.
glad to have you. So,
And you're
yeah.
in New Hampshire, like an hour away from where my birth father grew up. So I feel a connection to you just from that.
Yep. We want to just dig right in. Tell us from the start how you like to tell your story. Some people like to start at the beginning. Is that where you would like to start?
Well, I was a baby scoop era domestic infant adoption in the terms that adoptees are now labeling themselves with. I was born in November 1951 to an unmarried uh, junior in college from a very well-to-do, well-connected family in West Virginia, which was a huge shock to me when I found that out. I was raised in the suburbs of New York City.
Oh,
What suburbs?
Larchmont in Westchester County. And
You went from one wealthy family to another wealthy family.
well, I didn't really go to a wealthy family. We were okay, but my dad was a pediatrician back in the days when doctors gave each other professional courtesy, which meant they didn't charge um, the families of doctors. We were a pretty healthy family, so we didn't get a whole lot of benefit from that professional courtesy, but a lot of doctors had kids. So my dad took care of a lot of patients for free. He would
I,
get bottles of liquor and fruit of the month club and similar things every Christmas from the doctors, but it didn't exactly put as much money in your pocket as you might assume that a doctor would be earning. And actually, I've been that same kind of lawyer in my custody and child abuse practice, earning
Oh, we'll have to get
yeah,
to that.
earning less than most paralegals do, but that's okay because I was not ever in it for the money.
like
Well,
that.
so we'll get to that. Where you said your birth mother was from West Virginia. Where were you born then? How did you end up in a suburb in New York City?
Yeah.
I was born in Brooklyn, New York.
Oh, okay.
My my uh, my mother apparently had had some innocuous heart murmur as a child. So when she became pregnant by her longtime boyfriend, um, her story didn't, or her parents didn't send her to a home for unwed mothers that would have been the norm at the time. They sent her to live with her older sister and brother-in-law who lived in Queens. He was a lawyer, and she worked as, I think at the time, she may have been a secretary in his law firm, or she may have been a quartermaster, worked for a quartermaster somewhere. I'm not entirely sure about that, but they lived in Queens. And so my mother, for the last 4 months of her pregnancy, um, was sent to live with her sister and brother-in-law in Queens. And her sister's gynecologist was affiliated with the Brooklyn Hospital, and he basically,
Oh,
ended up doing that with my mother, whom nobody knew my aunt was pregnant at the time her sister came to stay with her.
oh,
So I had a cousin who is my best friend and to whom I dedicated my book, and refer to her as the midwife into my birth family. Um, I believe we bonded in utero during those 4 months that we overlapped, because we immediately clicked, and we are in contact, you know,
wow.
every single day. It's been 15 years since I found, and we are still in contact pretty much
Oh,
every single day.
So she was kept.
Well, her mother was married.
that's the one that was living
Right.
in the
Yes.
apartment.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes. Gotcha.
so she was also born at the Brooklyn Hospital
And
four
can
months.
I ask you something? Your biological mother was dating your father. Was there no
Yes.
chance they were long-term relationship, you said, and of course 1951, pretty bad to get pregnant out of wedlock.
Yeah.
They couldn't get married or?
And, it was interesting because my adoptive parents, who were wonderful people and treated me very well, so I'm not bitter against them. I may be bitter against the system and the sealed records law, but I have no bitterness about the family I was raised in. They were either told or were led to believe that my parents were married
Oh,
and were Catholic, which created all sorts of questions for me. Then why the hell was I placed for adoption? But
Right.
that's another part of my story. I
And
later
your
found
parents that adopted you, were they not able to have children? Is
they were
hence
not.
okay.
They were
And did
not.
you
And
were you the only one?
no, they adopted my older brother,
Hmm.
who's 3 years older than I am, also of Irish descent, but we are not biologically related to each other. But I later found out that there were a lot of reasons why my parents did not get married, and my mother never told my father that she was pregnant.
Oh.
Oh.
But
And they were a couple.
they were a couple. They were, very serious. However,
Hmm.
I think their families did not really approve of their relationship. They met in college in Morgantown, West Virginia. My father was from Mercer County, which is south of there. And contrary to what the agency told me, that the families knew each other, they did not know each other. My mother's family were Republicans. My father's family had kind of a split. My father was very involved, liberal Democrat. His mirror image twin brother
Hmm.
was a still is, he's still alive, a conservative Republican. So that side of the family are Republican. My father and his kids were Democrats. And my paternal grandfather, and I'm not sure when all of the timing was that he got to his third wife, who was a wonderful person and was his widow. Um, he was divorced at least 2 times by the time I was born. Uh, he had 3 sons and a daughter. The daughter was the youngest. The 3 sons, all of whom became attorneys, lived with their father in West Virginia. The daughter, who like me has a master's degree in English and taught college English, she went to live with her mother, who remarried. I'm not sure how many times my grandmother remarried, at least twice, but
Wow.
to this very prominent Catholic family, the idea of somebody who had been divorced multiple times and was Protestant
Uh,
um, did not make him a very good match. Now, from my father's standpoint, he had some kind of disagreement with his father. I later spoke to his widow about it, and she had a slightly different version, but there was a break in their relationship, and he joined the Marines.
wow. He left
Um,
college and joined the Marines.
he left college, joined the Marines, later returned to college, and
And
then,
by the way, he did not know about you. He did not know she was pregnant. So this is all information
well,
you.
she never told him.
Mm.
When I talked to him, I was 57,
Hmm.
and I called him after having sent him um, a somewhat ambiguous fax with my resume, because I look better on paper than I am in real life, I think. So I faxed him my 11-page resume and said, if you are and I gave his name. I don't use his name in the book because he chose not to acknowledge me.
Oh,
Although I think there's, how many twin brothers who are lawyers in West Virginia are there? I mean, anyone who knows them, it'll be very easy to figure out. I do use their first names, Bob and Fred, but for this purpose, I won't use his last name. But I said, if you are the Bob blank who worked on the Kennedy campaign, I think you have something to do with my choice of profession. Now, what that referred to is the 24 hours after I found my birth family, I was on the internet the whole time and had learned a great deal about this man. My mother had died 2 years earlier.
Oh, she had.
Well, let's
So
back up, and because we've jumped way far ahead. Did you only just find your birth mother recently, or
I
is this
found
all fairly new?
I found everybody the same day or the
Oh,
So
same
you waited
night.
you weren't until you were in your 50s, you did no search or anything?
Oh, I had searched. I
Okay, so
had
let's go.
searched.
When did you, so how was your life growing up in your adoptive family? You always knew you were adopted?
I
Was it
did.
okay?
My first memory in life was being told I was adopted. I was
oh,
about 2.5. I don't remember exactly what my mother said. I asked her. She didn't remember exactly what she said either. But I know that I had some kind of understanding that there was some other mother involved that I would never meet. That's all I know. I remember I cried. I remember she cried. I can picture exactly where I was when she
huh.
told me, sitting on one of my brother's twin beds when my mother had a big oval wicker basket of laundry that she had carried up from the basement and was in my brother's room folding it to put away. And somehow we had this conversation. And
That's
I can
crazy. That's an early memory. That
It
is
Yeah,
is
really.
two
the
and a half.
earliest the earliest memory that I have in my life. And
Oh,
so I had questions, as I grew up, and I asked questions. And as many adoptees of that era, I didn't want to hurt my parents' feelings. I would often ask my questions when I was in the car with my mother, and she had to be looking at the road and couldn't be, looking at me,
yeah.
but I could be looking at her to gauge her response. And I would kind of ask little by little, which
Did
is
it,
how I,
Yeah.
even at that young age, like, did it alter your feelings, or did it give you, do you remember the feeling that you had when you said you cried? Do you know what you were crying about?
I was crying at the loss of a mother,
Okay.
Mm,
whatever that meant. I didn't have, I later, because I didn't know a lot and I was trying to make sense of it, because the information that I got from my parents, well, mostly my mother, fairly early on, in response to my questions, was that my parents were mostly Irish, which, according to Ancestry, every time they revise their ethnicity estimates, I get less and less Irish, which kills me because I was an
that's your
Irish
identity.
Catholic girl, and that was my identity.
Yeah.
Um, and my friends from Ireland, often refer to me as more Irish than the Irish.
And now
But
you're not.
Oh,
and now I'm more Scottish. But I'm still, I think the last percentage was like 18% Irish. I'm more English than I wanted to be. That's thanks to my birth father. And it was quite a blow learning that the oppressors of my people were my people.
right?
But
I'm in the same position. I
That's
have
so,
English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh,
yeah, that's me.
that's awesome.
with some French and Norwegian thrown in.
I have a
Yeah.
little French, I have a little Spanish, I have a little Scandinavian, but
Scandinavian too, yeah.
my Celtic roots are what have resonated with me the
Yeah.
most. And because I saw my parents were married, I was a pretty smart kid. Um, and so you wonder why married Irish Catholic parents basically placed their child for adoption in infancy. And I knew I had been in a receiving home, came home on or about my adoptive father's birthday, which was March 9th. I was born November 15th.
Oh, so you
So,
were
Yeah, a while.
you
6,
know,
7 months of,
no, it's like 4 months.
Yeah.
oh, oh yeah. Sorry, my
And,
math.
but what happened? So being a creative, imaginative kid, I started, spinning all of these hypotheticals to try and explain how this child was placed for adoption. And it usually it was always tragic, and it usually ended up being my fault. And I
Oh,
cried
yeah.
many tears at night. First I thought, okay, my mother died in childbirth. And my father, who desperately loved my mother, could not bear to look at this child, the instrument of his wife's death, and take the child in. But because he rationally understood it wasn't really my fault, wasn't intentional that I had done anything, placed me for adoption.
Wait,
So
how old
that
were you when you were doing these stories? Like your whole childhood? Kind of,
4, 5
yeah.
on,
It
by the
really
time I was a
affected you.
teenager, she was an unwed mother.
Right.
Okay. But
It progressed. The story
but
progressed.
before that, and I watched a lot of Shirley Temple
Yeah.
movies, and I watched Dumbo, and I watched Pinocchio,
Oh God,
and
heartbreaking.
non-adoptees receive those things in a very different
Yeah.
way. And in fact, in my book, I've got a couple of footnotes about the Dumbo and the
Oh,
Pinocchio, situations. And
yeah.
I my second, and I'm thinking this is the order, but I could be wrong. The second thought I had, because I was born in November, and I knew I was born in New York City. I'm not sure that I understood, Queens, Brooklyn, whatever. And apparently my receiving home was in Queens. Nobody would tell me the lady's name. I said, I want to say thank you, because what I read in the reports said that I was a happy, bubbly kid who entertained your children and everybody was kind to me. Why can't I know this woman's name, to just say thanks and to meet her? But, as you are well aware,
Yeah.
agencies are very invested in maintaining their
Secrecy.
gatekeeper roles.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Agencies take away your agency.
Yep.
absolutely, absolutely
100%.
do. And so I thought, okay, they were in an apartment. They were a young married couple. It's November. They probably lit a fire, probably set the apartment on fire. My father, who of course was a handsome, noble person, scooped me up with a blanket, rushed me outside, made sure I was in a safe place, and then rushed back in to get his beloved wife from the apartment, which was now totally engulfed in flames. And he was not allowed to save his wife. So the decision to save me cost my mother her life. So again, this was a tragedy
I
that
think it's interesting that the mother is always having
the
to die.
mother's always the victim. The mother in this case is always the victim. The
And you're the
father
villain.
is always the rescuer, and I am always directly or indirectly the agent of her death.
Right?
And so
This really
culpable,
this really affected you, knowing
this
they were married.
I wonder
totally
Yeah.
if
affected me.
that, and
Yeah.
also being so young when you were told. I mean, I think it's good to know, but I wonder if that played a piece too. You were so young.
And
I don't
obviously
know.
inquisitive.
I think I would have gotten there because I was the little sister who always glommed on to whatever my brother was doing.
Yeah.
So I learned to read early. My parents were both very articulate people. My father was a great storyteller. Yes, he read us stories, but he also told us stories
Yeah. I
and
love
made
that.
up stories. And on the 6-hour drive up to New Hampshire for our summer vacation, he would just be making up these stories as he went. And because this was an era where pediatricians still made house calls, my dad, who didn't have an associate till I was about 12, and apparently had made some comment about how I wish he was a plumber so he would have regular hours, which I realize plumbers don't, but I didn't at the time. So he took me and my brother separately on some of his house calls and locked us in the car with the radio on and a roll of lifesavers while he would go in and take care of some kid and then come out. And he would
It's a
pose
dangerous treat to leave young kids.
he would pose these questions to me like, okay, um, between now and when I get back, I want you to invent something. And of course, I invented things that already existed. Maybe I had a little twist on it or whatever, but he engaged that part of my
Yeah.
brain very, very early on. And, from a little kid, he would tell stories and they would say, okay, now you tell me a story. So that was just part of my and then I ended up getting a degree in creative writing.
Yeah.
But, being a storyteller and trying to think outside the box and try to explain things. How do you think this windshield wiper works? Or, he'd ask me things like that. So my brain was engaged in that sort of way very early on.
Yeah, and it didn't make sense that they'd be married and give you it's a strange thing to have told you even,
And
or to be told.
Well, yeah, I wonder
and
if did the agency
I
tell them
must.
that?
I don't know that the agency told my parents that. I think my mother might have assumed when the agency said they were together for a long time. I
Wow.
don't know that. And she couldn't remember. That was the clear impression she had. My parents were scrupulously honest to the point that the one time when the IRS audited them, the IRS gave them money back. But she had a very clear impression that my parents were married. They didn't think back in 1951 of all the questions that we as adoptees wish our adoptive parents
Yeah.
would have asked
Right.
and didn't collect. And when I've been, the sample adoptee on a hot seat for different groups of prospective adoptive parents, I always say these are the things you need to ask about. And when I've represented birth mothers, I've said, really important, write a letter, give the child something, a locket, a blanket, or something. I got my genes and that was it.
Yeah.
And you would always feel so bad when you talk to other adoptees. Oh yes, this is the locket that my mother left for me, or this was the little stuffed animal. And I figured, damn, she didn't give me anything, nothing. She just wiped me out of her life and went on and actually got married to somebody else not all that much later, after my birth. But the one hypothesis I had where I was not directly to blame, other than the fact that my parents were in a car to take me, the newborn, to meet other relatives when they got in this tragic car accident that, of course, killed my mother. And by the way, what does this say about how we viewed women? That all growing up, it never occurred to me that my mother might have been able to get out of the burning apartment on her own.
Right. Right.
No,
It's what
she
you're
had
fed.
to
I was thinking of this while you were
She had to be
talking. It's just
saved by a
she
gallant,
had to wait and be saved by the prince who comes in and
yeah.
rescues her. So
it's the stories.
I'm
Mhm.
more evolved than I was, but I can look back just in the smallest areas how we absorb societal
Yeah.
views of men and women and identity and whatnot.
I just
But
read an article today that had to do with identity and how, adoptees just their identities are always shifting. The less they know, the more they don't have a firm identity. You search
and
your whole life.
in my case, the more I knew, the less I knew.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And in
Yeah.
fact, I used to, as I said, be a sample adoptee. I refer to it as adoptee on the hot seat, helping several different, the state Department of Children's Services,
Good.
the Catholic Social Services, several private adoption agencies who, by the way, all believed in open adoption. And one even hired me to write a law that would allow for open adoption, which I did, but which never, got passed. The state eventually did do some minor opening up, but so they were very much adoptee centric within the greater adoption services community. But they wanted to really vet the options and views of the prospective adoptive parents, because this is now in the, I did this from like the mid 70s to the 90s would be the sample adoptee. And at that point, if you want to look at, and it's offensive, but I use the terminology because I think it's accurate. If you want to look at the supply and demand marketing of, especially of infants, especially of healthy white infants, there were more people standing in line to adopt these kids than there were kids becoming available.
Still the case. Yeah.
Yes, abortion,
Yeah,
abortion became legal. Unwed motherhood became socially acceptable. And so, there were a lot of people and the agencies that I dealt with, they wanted to know what the views were among these prospective adoptive parents. And
Always wanting their views, but not
I
the views of
know. That's what I was
adoptees.
thinking.
well, no, they wanted to know how receptive they would be. They would have them meet with a birth mother, they would have them meet with an adoptive parent, but then they would have them meet with an adoptee. And they liked me because I'm a pretty plain spoken, maybe controversial, kind of person. And when I first started doing it in the mid 70s, there was a certain degree of hostility
I was
because
gonna
I was
say.
already searching. I mean, I knew since I was 12 I was going to search. In law school, I tried to get some more ideas of how to do it. Then, of course, you had Florence Fisher, do In Search of Anna Fisher, and then I later found Jean Payton's Orphan Voyage, and I realized, hey, searching is a thing. I was a very early member of ALMA, which of course was headquartered in New York, and my agency was in Manhattan. I was one of their plaintiffs in their unsuccessful class action lawsuit.
Oh,
But I had some knowledge, and I found, except in one case, I found every single person, birth parent or birth child, that I searched for free for clients because I didn't want to take any money for helping people, reconnect. I found every single person, but I could not find my own, and I could not find one other person's. But so I
That's
knew
frustrating.
Florence Fisher herself looked at my search book, sat down with me, and she said, I can't think of a single thing that you could do that you haven't already done. And yet I kept doing things. But
Especially back then, we didn't have the tools
and we didn't
at
have
our
the internet.
disposal, right?
You didn't have the internet. So you're
Yeah.
sending you're sending letters through the post office with a $10 check asking for birth records, and then you're waiting. Everything, the waiting, on the one hand, it gave you time to think, but on the other hand, it was frustrating as all get out.
Yeah.
But I would tell these, prospective adoptive parents that I was searching for my birth family. And so at the beginning, in the mid 70s, people were saying, why weren't your adoptive parents good to you?
Right.
And we have every adoptee I've ever talked to who has searched has heard this. How could you do this to your adoptive parents? You should get down on your hands and knees and thank God that they took you in and treated you as if you were their own.
As if.
I mean, which lays on the adoptee a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid.
No, never.
And even though my parents never laid that on me, other people in the community certainly did. And I can
Well, and it's
remember
societal. It's a societal attitude.
absolutely. And I can remember when I did college in 2.5 years, and I was invited to Phi Beta Kappa, but you had to pay like $30 or something for the lifetime for your dues. And I thought about it, I really can't. My daughter was born in wedlock, conceived in wedlock, was
Let's
born
make that clear.
18 months after I got married. So nobody can question that. Because I was going to be a good girl. I
Right?
was going to be the Irish Catholic girl who didn't have sex till my wedding night. No matter what happened, I stuck to that because I wasn't going to make the mistake that I figured my mother had made. But I said, I don't know that I can spend this amount of money. But I thought, if my parents can say, my adoptive parents, that I graduated from college in 2.5 years, Phi Beta Kappa, that maybe that would go more towards me being a good bargain, which, as I said, was nothing they put on me.
Isn't that interesting
And
that
they
we have
would have been horrified
to think that? Yeah.
that crossed my mind. Same thing when I got a master's degree in English. Same thing when I graduated from law
Yeah.
school, also in 2.5 years, and then passed the bar on my first try. And then was writing law books and speaking all over the world about child advocacy and custody and child. Every time I got some kind of, achievement, part of me is saying, did this make me a good enough bargain?
Yeah.
What a horrible thing for society to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm lucky enough that I did achieve a lot of things. I know a lot of adoptees who didn't, who are wonderful people. And they feel, but maybe I wasn't, maybe I didn't meet their expectations. Or they were a sports family and I wasn't into sports, or they were
Yeah. Right.
musical and I was, whatever the disconnects between the adoptive parent and the child, really, really rather horrible.
It
But
is. It's like trying to constantly. I remember what just you talking when I was getting a divorce, thinking, I don't want to tell my parents. I'm in this agony, but I don't want to tell them because of disappointment. And they didn't put that on me either. But I didn't want to be that let down person.
right.
It's,
And
and I
I
think we
felt
live
that way
with
with my
this.
divorce also.
Yeah.
You
It's
don't want to
crazy.
disappoint your parents. And when I was able to give them a grandchild, they were significantly older. They were basically the age of my birth family grandparents.
Oh,
Um, and I really wanted to give them a grandchild. My daughter was the first grandchild. Um, because at the time my brother didn't have any children. And it was just such an important thing for me to do for my parents, as much
interesting.
as for myself, because I knew they were older and I didn't want them to die without having a grandchild. And, we were not a family who I felt estranged from, or that they didn't accept my child as their, grandchild. I mean, they were totally in love with her and infatuated with her. But back to the adoptee on the hot seat, the other half of that is they were saying, well, what if it turns out, they didn't use this terminology, but what if it turns out that your birth mother was a real slut, and she was just this horrible person, but now she's married, she has children, she has become a pillar of her society. How could you do this to her? How could you try and come into her life, expose the most shameful thing in her, in her background,
Yeah,
and
you're ruining people's lives on both
ruin her
sides.
life,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you
and
you are so problematic, Anne.
I know, I'm going to be the ungrateful daughter who hurt my parents that I wasn't grateful enough for, to ruin my mother's life, although she dragged herself out of the gutter and made something of herself. And now I'm throwing her back into the gutter. Well, those questions disqualified those prospective adoptive parents in that agency's
Oh,
view.
good. I'm glad to hear that.
So, I think it was a very useful thing. They wanted to know. By the time I ended my stint as adoptee on the hot seat, the prospective adoptive parents are saying, what information can we find out? What things can we get? How can we help our child so that our child, one, does not feel these things, two, will have things? How can we effectuate open communication with the birth family throughout our child's life? Because you're not only an adoptee, you're a lawyer, and you do adoption law and custody law and all of this, and they wanted to be very proactive. There was a huge shift in a period of less than 20 years among those particular people. And again, as I said, the agencies I did this for were very pro adoptee
Yeah.
agencies. And talking to me, they knew me in part as a lawyer because I might do some of their cases in court. Um, and so I had a certain amount of credibility. They didn't think I was this bitter, radical, you know, tear the building down kind of person.
How sad is that though? Because that's actually a lot of incredible birth mothers and adoptees who have spoken out do get labeled that the radical, oh
That's
my
right.
God, push you away. You're
And
horrifying
there
for
and
us.
there and there are adoptees who will criticize me and they say I'm still in the fog. Believe me, I am not in the fog.
Yeah, you're
I don't
working.
I don't know that I've been in the fog since I was pretty
2 and a
little.
half.
But I will tell you that part of my healing, of my feelings about needing to prove myself to be a good bargain for my parents, came when I had a light bulb moment representing some adoptive parents who, and I will not do and have never done placements. I think lawyers should not be in the child placing business. Um, but if people have already, arranged a placement, often through pastors or, people in their communities, and it was, a done deal, I would do their adoption. And when I represented birth mothers and birth fathers, I had them sign, at the time they signed their relinquishment, I had them sign waivers of confidentiality and instructions that their child should be given any and all information,
Good.
including identifying information about them. I obtained the child's original birth certificate before the adoption so I could give that original birth certificate to the child. And I had the birth parents, if I was representing them, sign waivers allowing me to do that. I had the adoptive parents sign all kinds of things allowing me to do that.
Yeah.
So that any adoptees who came back to me were not going to, run into a situation. Well, I'm sorry, attorney-client privilege, I can't tell you what happened. And any children that I represented who were in the foster care system, I to this day still have their files. Everything that happened from the 1970s on in their life, psychological evaluations, case reports, court summaries. I have it all.
Do
And
people come and ask? Because we had a guest, Michaela,
every now and
on
again,
who
yeah.
could not get hers from anybody. So I'm glad that you have that because I don't think this is the norm. All
It
right.
was not the norm. And when
Still
I,
is
I mean,
not.
I represented a lot of children. I've been very involved in the American Bar Association's development of standards of representation for children, which are now nationally accepted, and have been involved in a lot of, nationally policy things about how you represent children's and where your children and where your loyalty lies, and it's to the child. And so I have made it a point that even as I destroy a lot of old files because, I've been in practice for over 47 years. You get a lot of files. You can't continue to save everything, every single file of every single child I have ever represented, of every adoption I've ever been involved in. Those are all saved.
Do you, now knowing what you know about the politics of adoption, still believe in adoption? I mean, to me, with everything I've found out and discovered, I no longer believe that that's a good
Question.
solution. I think family preservation is really should be the priority, kinship, and then in failing all else, because there really aren't that many, as you know, and you said, babies.
Infants.
Mothers mostly want to raise their children. Adoption is very problematic. And I'm wondering if you have come around to that at all.
Well, it's interesting. I have a quote scholarly journal article that I always write as I say that I'm also writing it as a person with lived experience. It's going to be appearing in the Family Courts Review October of this year, and it's called The Unacknowledged, if I can remember the title, The Unacknowledged Trauma and Disenfranchised Grief in Infant Adoption. And one of the things, this came out of kind of an invitational think tank that was held at Hofstra Law School last fall. And it was that kind of, they called it a convening. And the purpose of that was to be revolutionary in what we could do regarding children, healthcare, all kinds of things. And I was put in the legal group. And out of that, some of us were asked to write articles that would be, vetted, like peer review, like always happens, and those kinds of things. And to try and come up with some recommendations and some solutions. I do believe, based on my 47 years of experience, that there are certain circumstances where adoption is appropriate. And if possible, should be kinship adoption. But there are some kin families that are so toxic and inappropriate, they should not be anywhere near those kids.
There are, though, just a tiny bit of pushback, because there are situations in which, let's say, the birth mother is so young or has a drug problem that later they might get their lives
No,
together.
absolutely. I'm
Why
saying,
change the name and identity of
no,
these
I am
children?
saying that there are some circumstances.
Mhm.
Now, in my article and in my beliefs, I say I have three recommendations, policy recommendations for change. One, that we abolish all sealed records of any kind, and that any document or any kind of record that a non-adoptee has access to, an adoptee should have access to. There should be zero distinction.
Mhm.
Number two, that there should be well, first of all, in what I think everybody at that whole convening agreed, there need to be resources. Most adoption come because of lack of resources.
Mhm.
We need to have physical resources. We need to have medical resources, mental health resources. One of the examples I use in my book that I have seen many times in my own practice, I've represented a lot of grandparents with young substance abusing children who get pregnant. And the grandparents who love their grandchild take their
Don't have the
grandchild in.
resources. Yeah.
We get guardianships for those kids. Sometimes just in Arizona, where I'm licensed to practice, they're called dependencies. They're whatever a given state calls their child welfare proceedings. We will sometimes file one of those and get temporary custody that may end up lasting for several years. If it looks like it's going to go on for a long time, we have something called permanent guardianship that is different from a probate guardianship with consent, where the parent can come back and all they have to do is say, I want my kid back. And the permanent guardianships are a little more a little more permanent in that they have to show that it would be in the best interest of the child. Most of those are kinship, or what we now call fictive kinship,
Mm-hmm.
which is friends and people who kind of act like relatives even though they aren't really related. People that the kids know. And when I represented a kid who was taken by CPS, the first thing I asked the kid is, who do you feel comfortable with? Is there anybody that, you know, you would be okay living with, even if it is just for a week while we get to the next court hearing, if everyone has decided that the parents, you know, can't do that. We now have in many places in the country something called family team decision making. It goes by a number of different names, but when a child is brought into the system, the parent can assemble friends, family, whoever their support system is, pastors, rabbis, therapists, you know, whoever they rely on, and they get together and provide, at least theoretically, and when I write for lawyers, I'm saying, lawyers, you need to get this group together and you need to be proactive in, you know, coming up with your own safety plan that is going to allow for contact. And if it is, you know, this one parent who is substance abusing, but there are other family members who are okay, who will abide by the rules not to allow contact that isn't, you know,
Safe.
authorized by the state, which is the quickest way of getting the kid yanked out of the kinship placement. You know, that is going to be best. We need to provide substance abuse resources, housing resources.
Yes.
You know, I'm one of those.
Daycare. What about daycare too?
Absolutely, childcare. I followed my birth father's, you know, politics into
Speaking of,
believing.
I'd love to jump back to your story to hear how you finally, your search was finally complete.
Well, you know, I had tried everything on my own. I had hired private investigators. I turned down the offer from a tabloid magazine. I don't think it's still in existence, the Midnight Sun.
Nice.
Who called me and said, we will find your birth mother. All we want is the right to print the story. And I had tried as much as I could to be very protective of my birth parents' privacy, which of course, having recently published an adoption search and reunion memoir that, you know, kind
That
of
went out the
outs
window.
them. But, you know, certainly before I tried so hard and I turned them down, much as I was tempted, you know, in law school, in my family law course, I went in to see my family law professor and I said, we're talking a lot about the best interests of the child. At what point does the best interest of the child become the bottom of the heap over the presumed interests of the birth mothers and the adoptive parents, many of whom don't have those, you know,
No.
feelings at all.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, gee, you know, that's an interesting question. Why do you want to know? And I talked to him a little bit about my experience. And he said, why don't you just bribe somebody at the agency?
That's
This
how
is
I
my
was
law
found.
school professor. But I was the good girl.
Right?
I didn't want to get disbarred before I ever took the bar exam, you know, or be prevented. And I couldn't believe that this law professor is telling me to bribe somebody at the agency. Not that it didn't cross my mind, well, gee, what if I did? No, it's wrong. You know, I would misrepresent who I was in relation to my mother named me Anne, her name was Anne.
Oh.
She used a fake last name in everything, which is what delayed me for
Did you
35
grow up?
years.
Did you grow up, Anne?
Oh,
I
wait,
did. I
she just
did.
said,
Both. Okay.
I did.
I missed, I don't want to miss this. Oh, I just lost it.
You
Oh, well.
have a last name like Haralambie. How much do you want to throw in front of it? You know, my
You're
birth
saying, I know
mother-
what it was. You just said that your birth mother used a fake last name, and that
Yes.
was, okay, that was the key
Yep,
piece to
right.
this whole thing. Okay,
She used-
this
if
is why
people-
you couldn't, the search was so
Yeah.
difficult.
And people asked me why I called my book not Nicholson, the story of a first daughter. And I said, because my mother was not Nicholson.
Uh,
Therefore, looking for Ann Nicholson, I knew within, 4 months when she was born, because she was 19 when she gave birth to me. She was 20 when she signed the relinquishment papers. I knew her first name was Ann. That was it. I later changed the name of my law firm to Ann Nicholson Haralambie Attorneys. But I had, back when you had stationery printed, like you ordered it from printing companies, I had stationery printed that said Ann Nicholson. And, most of my actual search was done after I was married, actually after I was divorced. But I was still at one point using my husband's last name. And so I would write things on my Ann Nicholson stationery saying, I'm looking for the birth record of Ann Nicholson. And then I would sign it, Ann Huck Nee Nicholson, because I was Nee Nicholson. My New York City birth index lists me as female Nicholson. Kings County, my adoption decree lists me as Ann Nicholson. So I was born Ann Nicholson. May have been a fake name, but I wasn't lying. And, my moral self-righteous sensibility did not like us, misleading people to think I was looking for my own birth record. I didn't come out and say that. And I still feel some shame for having, done that. But
you do?
and
You still feel some? That's
I
interesting.
do, and I'm angry at a system who
Yeah.
put me in a morally ambiguous situation
Yeah.
that I never should have been put in.
Yeah.
So how did you finally get to the search?
Well,
Trying
I
to get to the bottom of the sand.
had a client who I was going to, for free, try and find her birth mother. And I was starting to put things together, and I got a phone call from her like 2 or 3 weeks later. And she said, you can stop searching. I had hired a searcher who found my birth mother. And I'm saying, you're kidding. And she said, no, this lady's great. It was Pam Slayton. So I said, great, give me her contact information. And I sent her all of my stuff. And she said, geez, I don't know what you haven't done. Because it had been so complete, so extensive. I had so many records. I had actually found an Ann Nicholson who was born within that 4-month period, who was a good Irish Catholic girl from West Orange, New Jersey, just a short bridge between her and the Brooklyn Hospital. And I had DNA testing. Her sister was a nun who was the right height. I had my best friend, we had this long, I don't go into it now, it's all in my part of the mystery novel that is my memoir. But she had, I talked to her on the phone because I found her through Who's Who in American Colleges, which, by the way, is not something that sits on anybody's bookshelf. I had to get it through interlibrary loan. They printed out a copy of this, and she got a BS in nursing at a time when the bastard children of medical people would be placed in medical homes. My father was a doctor, my mother was a nurse, Irish Catholic girl, did very well. Had a picture of her in this Who's Who in American colleges or something. I didn't think I looked like her, but then again, I didn't think I looked like any of the pictures I later found of my birth family either. But
how long did you think she was your mother? A long time?
Oh, decades.
Oh,
at least 20 years. At least
okay.
20 years. And I called her. I my best friend and I went to New Jersey on this little, how do I want to say it again, misleading thing. We were part of a small press poetry chapbook publishing company and were members of their trade organization, COSMEP, the Committee of Small Magazine Editors and Publishers. And COSMEP just happened to have had a small press library project to get these small press materials into libraries. So we laid the foundation. I contacted the local library and said that we were interested in maybe having that library, do a small press book rack. And that was actually, I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself because I didn't know this when I called Ann Nicholson from New Jersey. And, I also recorded the call and have a transcript of
Oh
it
gosh. And she's like,
in
I
my
haven't had a baby.
in my book. Oh no, she had 7 children.
Oh,
I would have been
So
the eldest of I would have
she
been the
did,
eldest of 8.
how long did you go when you thinking you were each other's mother-daughter? How
Well,
long did this?
she knew she wasn't my mother
Okay.
because all of her 7 children that she and her husband had were accounted for, and
Oh, okay.
she knew she wasn't pregnant. But I
Okay,
didn't
so
necessarily believe her
oh,
because, it was a weird phone call, and I thought
I'm
that she
sure.
kind of said she was, and then she kind of said she wasn't. And I said,
She
"Are you
may
by
have her
any?"
own secret that you're like
You know,
outing.
I said, "Did you by any?" Well, and I told her I have, I don't need to tell anybody in your family. I don't, blah blah blah. I was well treated. I was well educated. I, don't hold any ill will. Blah blah. And she was very empathetic during this whole call. But I said, are you by any chance short? At the time I was 5'2". Unfortunately, at 72, I've shrunk a little, much to my dismay. 5'2" was like the
yeah.
shortest I wanted to be. But she said, I said, is your family by any chance short? And she said, no. She said, I myself am 5'7", which I think of as being really tall. So I'm thinking, what is she, queen of the pygmies or something? But she said, I have, a sister who's a nurse who's 5'1", and a sister who's a nun who's 5'3". Well, part of the information, which turned out to be true from the agency, was that my mother was 5'3". So I'm thinking, oh, 5'3", a nun,
That's
who
your right.
I
Yeah.
later found out she had been out of the convent for the 3 or 4 years surrounding my conception and birth. So I figured, when I was younger, I always had hoped to marry a 6-foot tall, blonde haired, blue eyed ex seminarian. So I
Because
figured, oh,
that's a thing.
my father was a priest who knocked up this nun. So of course
So your
she's
stories are continuing in your head.
absolutely,
But then
absolutely.
does it only take this one conversation to then realize, okay, I mean,
No,
at which point do you then find your mother?
after DNA testing of all 3
It took
sisters
that long?
over the years, after talking to and meeting the nun,
You had them all take DNA tests and everything.
Sister Mary Jude,
Oh my
Mary,
goodness.
Virgin Mother, Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. Believe me, I had it's called confirmation bias.
Yeah.
And I had, there were so many things that were the same. And the nun who somebody had gone to see her, who was also a nurse, she was a hospital administrator actually, and showed her my picture. And the nun, you know, this was like several years after I had contacted Ann Nicholson. And she had said, no, my sisters, I was around, they weren't pregnant with anybody else. But she looked at my picture and she says, well, yeah, you do kind of look like us. Well, my late daughter was a professional artist. And she wasn't a professional artist at the time we did this, but she was an artist since she was 3 years old. And we went to, she got transferred back to the mother house of her order in New Jersey. And my daughter, my grandson, and I went to see Sister Mary Jude. We took her out to dinner. We
Okay.
sat so that my grandson and I are on either side of the nun, and my daughter is across the table because she would be able to see if there was resemblance.
Did the
Uh,
nun have, was she a, well, that,
she was wonderful.
Yeah,
She was wonderful. She was helpful. She gave me a lot of her family tree.
that you're
Um,
not part of?
I said,
where
you
is your
know,
real mother? How
it
did you
must, I
find
said,
her?
it must be, because I figured, all right, you're a nun, you can't hide your height, but you can use a different name. So my first hypothesis was she used her sister Anne's name. Then, okay. And I thought she was really truthful. And she was also very empathetic and very helpful. And I said, it has to be somebody who knows your family well enough to have given this information. So she's giving me the names of various relatives. She put me in touch with her aunt who was in a nursing home in Scottsdale, Arizona, whom I went to visit.
Oh my goodness.
And then my paid private investigators, everybody kept coming back to this family in New Jersey. I also found a family in New Orleans, an Ann Nicholson in New Orleans, but wasn't, quite as sure. It still was mostly the New Jersey Nicholsons. But
Well,
you know,
I have two questions to get back to how you found your mother. So when you did DNA,
so I asked Sister Mary Jude if she would do
yeah,
DNA, and she
that
said
was
yes.
okay.
And at that point, I knew enough about doing DNA because we would do paternity tests for child support and other reasons,
Yeah.
and they would test 10 alleles. On those, the report came back. I was actually at a conference in Colorado and was on the ski slopes when I got the call from the genetics lab that said that Sister Mary Jude and I matched on 7 of the 10 alleles that were tested.
And this is before Ancestry and all of that exists.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. Well, what I knew from my work with paternity cases is you pretty much either matched on all or none.
Okay.
But I had never run across 7. So I call Sister Mary Jude from below the ski lift and I say, well, I think you must be my aunt because we match on 7 of these 10. And so she intervened with her sister Anne to ask Anne, and this was when DNA tests were like $1,000, but it was worth it to me, to find out. So she said to Anne, and then she reported back to me that she was able to convince her sister to take a DNA test. And Anne says, but I know I'm not her mother. Why can't she believe me?
No kidding, because
I'm sorry, Mary Jude and I matched on 6 alleles of the 10. So she convinced, her sister to take, the buccal swab. And I had told the people, I said, I don't need fingerprints or anything else. I mean, these people, I've been in touch with them for like 20 or 25 years.
my God.
And they, I keep coming back to them, but I think they're good people. And somebody from Alma's New York chapter or New Jersey chapter actually knew Ann Nicholson and vouched for her and sent me pictures from their parish directory of her and her family. And So Anne, agreed, and we matched on 7 of the 10 alleles.
So
Well,
are they related?
turns out I can find 0 relationship.
Huh.
So how did you,
so
okay, so this
we had
becomes a
the
dead,
third
ultimately
one.
this becomes a dead end.
We
We
had the
don't,
third
yeah,
one tested, nothing. But I
okay.
still wasn't done with that family because I figure it's got to be a cousin or somebody that we share this DNA with. But anyway, so that's going nowhere. I'm frustrated. My client tells me that Pam Slayton found her mother in just a couple of weeks. So I said, okay. So
Aha,
I
okay.
contact Pam. And Pam says, I'm going to throw out everything that you've done because you've done everything that, I would have done. And she then, they wouldn't tell me at the agency where my birth mother was from. And they said, well, somewhere in the East, not a city, not the deep South. They had said this early on back in the
Huh.
70s, So I narrowed it down to a variety of states, which did include West Virginia. But, so Pam narrowed things down to West Virginia, was able to narrow things down to West Virginia. And I was at another legal conference at another ski resort, and there was a lawyer from West Virginia there. So by now we had the internet and you could apply for birth certificates online. And he told me, well, in West Virginia, we don't have a state bureau of vital statistics to keep all of that. You have to go, county by county. And he said, all right, these are the counties most likely to have a Catholic birth mother. And he actually had one of his associates who was going to be in one of the counties. And he got the counties right, by the way. He had an associate go to clerk's office. They didn't have anything. I'm writing. And at this point, I've made a spreadsheet and I am emailing it to Pam, as I'm getting things, because people were emailing me back. And of course, I'm writing with my legal email address, which has in the signature Ann M. Haralambie, JDCWLS, and Nicholson Haralambie attorneys, blah, blah, blah. So you got the name Ann Nicholson in there. So I'm saying I'm looking for a birth record of Ann Nicholson, born between, these dates in West Virginia. And they were all coming back with nothing. And Pam is saying, this is not possible. I'm going to throw out the last name. And
Smartest thing.
how the hell are you going to find an Ann from West Virginia, And I still don't know exactly how she did it. But she called me on January 16th, 2009 at 6:00 in the evening, Arizona Mountain Standard Time, and said, I found your mother and she's alive. And this is her name. And I am like, is it too late, on the,
Right.
she lives in Ohio. I said,
Wow.
Ohio is in the Eastern time zone. Is it too late to call? And she said, no, I don't think so. And she had spoken at this point. I don't know how she found out my aunt's name, but she had spoken to my uncle in New Jersey, and had confirmed, that yes,
She
my
giving up a baby.
sister-in-law gave up this baby
Wow.
in November 1951, or had a baby in November 1951. And so Pam had found, she's not on the Social Security Death Index. It appears that she's living with her son. This is their, last name. And I don't use her married last name in the book either, so I'm not going to say it here. But we can call. So we call and a woman answers. And she doesn't usually do this, but because I also had been a professional searcher for many years and we were kind of collaborating on things at that point, she let me be conferenced in on this phone call. I was on mute, thank God. So I'm listening to this whole conversation, and she gets my sister-in-law and she says, hi, I'd like to speak to Anne, her married last name.
Gotcha.
Or no, she said, I'd like to speak to Anne. And she said, oh, I think you have the wrong number. And she said, oh, I'm looking for Anne, married last name. And she said, oh, she passed away 2 years ago. So I am now from the heights of excitement to the depths of despair. So I'm like crying my eyes out, glad I'm on mute. And she says, you know, Pam says, well, I'm a genealogist and I'm representing, you know, a woman, and we believe that Anne was her mother. And she said, well, I don't think so, but let me let you talk to my husband, who is my youngest brother, who is basically was within a year of the age of my daughter. And so, you know, he says, my mother was a very straight-laced, you know, woman, and she would not have had a child out of wedlock. We never heard of anything. So Pam says, well, this was the information that was given, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm emailing her. I said, does he want to see a picture? Because I don't know if I look like anybody.
Right.
So turns out I look like my mother more than any of her other 4 kids. So I emailed Pam some pictures. Pam says to Matt, my brother, I'm going to email you these pictures. And she says, well, listen, I'm going to go over to my sister Debbie's house. We live pretty close together, and, you know, email it over there. So she does. And she did tell them, she says, look, she's a lawyer. She's very well respected. You know, she's got a national
Doesn't want
reputation.
anything.
She's not looking for anything, you know, etc.
Sadly.
So, you know, half an hour later, I get a phone call. Hi, this is your brother Matt and your sister Debbie.
That's all it took was the picture.
Well, in between, they called their aunt and uncle.
Oh.
And the uncle, my sister later told me that the uncle said, Carolyn, it's time for the truth to come out. And so my Aunt Carolyn, who was 6 years older than my mother, who has since died, and she has since died, but Carolyn said, and the boy's name is Bob, and then she spelled out letter by letter his last name.
You got it all that one day. That's what you said.
Now, I didn't know that. They didn't tell me that at that point, but they had confirmed with their uncle that their mother had, in fact, had a child out of wedlock. And then other people are coming into this. I don't know whether it was an email chat or instant messaging or what it was. It was on AOL at the time. And all these other people are joining the conversation, including my niece, my sister's youngest daughter. And I've got my daughter in on this and everything. And I had said my daughter's an artist, and you know, I think somehow her magnum opus, either it was in my daughter's signature block or somehow I sent a picture of that or whatever. But my niece says to me, she was there with her girlfriend, and she said, oh, my girlfriend wants to know if your daughter is Opal Cat, which was my daughter's internet handle. And I'm going, yes. And she said, oh, she recognized the painting. You know, she's on the Straight Dope message board that my daughter
So
had
crazy.
Wow. So
small world.
Crazy
So
world.
that niece asks me, are you going to try and find your father? And I said, yes, but I'm not, I'm not sure. And he says, oh, well, this is his name. And they told me what my aunt had said in the background. So then I'm, Googling and doing all kinds of things. And an hour later, my niece says, so are you gonna contact him? He's a lawyer. And I'm going, well, I found somebody with that name, but I don't have his birth date. But I found somebody else with that last name who was my father's twin, who did have a picture and a year of birth. And he said, well, so I'm trying to just confirm before I make any contact. Just, oh no, yes, she is. It's in their older brother's obituary.
Oh,
They're going, how, because she's also Googling. So my niece sends me the obituary that shows that, yeah, Bob and Fred were twins, and their older brother Jack, who had died, and they were all
crazy.
lawyers. So it was
this is
just,
yeah.
it was a few days later that I actually contacted
Well, we
my birth
want to
father.
hear, it's been great hearing all the details. And people should read the book so to get really even more of it.
It's like a mystery novel. It
Yeah,
really is.
Yeah, because
totally.
we need to wrap up. Just wondering, are you still in reunion? Who's
Yep.
still alive? Have you, all of that stuff, at least so that we can depart on that knowledge.
Well, I met 3 of my 4 maternal siblings. We all
Oh,
had dinner together, and I met some nieces and nephews. My sister had very ambiguous feelings because she felt betrayed by her mother.
yeah.
Mm,
Although she said this explained a lot of things because my sister had a child out of wedlock. My daughter, her oldest son, and my youngest brother were all born within a year. In fact, the 3 of us, I straddled my sister's pregnancy and my mother's last pregnancy.
interesting.
And she said, this explains a lot why, when I told her that I was pregnant, she said, okay, we will raise the child and adopt the
Oh,
child,
Yeah.
or you can marry the boy and raise the child, which she did, but you are not to put that child up for adoption.
Oh,
isn't that amazing? Isn't that
always.
incredible?
Yep.
Like I think
A little piece of insight. And
That is a
my
big
many,
piece.
I don't know if you've read The Girls Who Went Away, but,
absolutely,
Yeah.
or even the most current
Relinquished.
one, Relinquished, about current adoptions.
absolutely. In
Yes.
fact, I cite both Gretchen Sisson and Ann Fessler in the works that I am currently writing.
That
Good.
really, like,
I know.
just hearing that is so touching.
Yeah. That's from her from her mouth when she wasn't alive. You're hearing what she would have wanted for
And
you.
my uncle said to me, he also has since died, but he died actually within 6 months of me finding. But I had gone out to dinner with them, and I actually was in the hospital with the family while he was dying of a stroke, just as a support to my cousin. And he said, your birthday was torture for your mother every
Oh,
year.
Mm,
And I said, Porter, it was torture for me too.
yeah.
mm,
What a waste,
What a long
yeah.
waste of time
didn't
with the
have to be
wrong
like that.
names. That's
Yeah.
right.
And my sister said to me, she said, you are everything that none of us were. She said, my mother would have been at so much peace and had a reason to live if you had found us
Well, just earlier.
before she died.
Yeah.
Mm.
This is such the
I
thing with the
tried.
time.
I
You tried.
tried.
Could have used a real name.
Will you send us
Yep.
your book and sign it? And
I will.
we have a
Send
library.
me an
Yeah,
address.
we'll get that too off when we're not recording. We'll talk about
But
that
I
and
will
send
tell
it
you,
to you.
my father, my first few conversations with him were very good. And you asked, did he know? And I said to him on that first phone call, I said, well, I said, one, did you know Ann Cottle? Do you remember Ann Cottle? He said, yes, we used to date. And I said, well, I'm her daughter. And she said that you were my father. That's like the first words out of my mouth. And I said, but I'm sure you didn't expect this, 57-year-old bombshell. And he said, well, I knew it was a possibility.
Oh,
And I said, oh, did she tell you she might be pregnant? And he said, oh, no. But I had friends who saw her
oh,
and told me they thought she might be pregnant. But I
Mm,
have a great ability to put things out of my mind.
oh,
And
compartmentalize.
he later decided, Linda Ronstadt, the singer, is a good friend of mine, and she was going to be doing a concert in North Carolina, and had suggested, she would give us tickets and then I could bring him back. He knew who she was, and could meet her. And she was very instrumental in my search. I talk about it in my book, but she was one of the most supportive
Huge
people,
fan.
yeah, big.
and
We're
Her.
an
big
adoptive mother.
fans.
And
She's an, oh,
Yeah.
we talk about adoption all the time. She was the one who recommended Ann Fessler's book to me, The Girls Who Went Away.
Oh,
And
so what happened? Did you go to the concert?
I said that, and no, his wife was very ill and later
mm,
died, and no. And then the family court judge from his town ended up hearing me give a keynote speech in Brooklyn at a national conference just that August. And we were talking about separating kids in the context of the child welfare system
mm,
and termination of parental rights, and how, we need to prioritize kids' connections with their birth family. And I
yes.
pointed out, I said, I never knew my birth family. I was adopted as an infant in a very good home, never mistreated, abused, neglected, nothing. And yet this has been a central trauma in my life, my whole life. And I searched for 35 years, actively searched for 35 years to find this family, and mentioned that it turned out that being a suburban New Yorker, was quite culture shock for me to find out that my
West
roots
Virginia.
were hundreds of years in West Virginia. And
Oh,
and so this judge had come up to me and said, where in West Virginia? And having been so careful not to out my birth parents, I was so shocked. I said, well, my mother was from Morgantown, my father was from Mercer County. And she said, Mercer County, I'm the juvenile and family judge in Mercer County. I said, well, maybe you know my father, and gave him, and she knew him very well.
wow.
And I
Crazy,
knew that his
Anne.
And we
wife
need,
had died, and I said, would it be beneficial for him? Would it be healing for him, or a bad thing for me to try and make contact right now? Because I was going to make my decision whether or not to push for a meeting with him based on, what she said. And she said, I think it would be very healing for both of you. So I eventually did go, and I kind of ran into him in a courtroom, and went to his office. He left before me. I saw him.
And that's it.
And I went to his office, and he was sitting in his secretary's office with his back to the door. And the secretary said, may I help you? And I said, I'd like to speak to Mr. Blank. And he turned his head around like me. He didn't have very much, swivel ability. And he said, who is it? And I said, Ann Haralambie. And he said, well, it's nice to see you, but I don't want to talk to you.
Wow.
oh,
And
Sorry.
no, he didn't say it's nice to see you. He says, well, I didn't want to talk to you. And I said, well, it was very nice to see you. And I turned and I left. And I went to my car, called Linda Ronstadt, and cried during the whole phone
I'm
call.
sure.
So people ask me, did you ever meet your father?
Kinda.
I don't know. I went to his
oh,
funeral, kind of incognito. There were some relatives there who knew me, so I hugged his surviving twin brother. His one of his nephews talked to me there. Since the book came out, I
Wow.
heard from another nephew who apparently people in my family have read the book. I don't know how they know about it, but they do. And he told me that their grandfather had told that generation of my two sisters, one of whom is an attorney, and brother, that it was not possible that he was my father.
Mm.
And my sister there, who I had been friends with on Facebook before she realized what my claim to being kin to her was, said, well, I believe that you believe that he's your father, but he's
Oh
not.
gosh.
This is for like closing. This is exactly, it still goes on. You're not
Yeah.
really,
But yeah, but because this nephew then called
We
me and said they read the book and he is willing to meet me. He, the nephew,
Oh good. Well, please.
after I sent him DNA results showing my DNA relationship. So it's story that is not over.
It's still evolving. Well, thank you for sharing everything you
yes,
have.
everything.
It's been fascinating. And we'll put the link to your book and your work,
Yeah, the work is, thank you.
advocacy work. That would be great. And wow, my mind is just spinning. Thank you for sharing.
We
Yeah.
all have different stories and it
We
all
sure
comes
do.
back to the system is broken. It
The
needs to be
system is broken.
That's a good, and
vastly,
you know more
vastly.
than anyone, you're in it.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's good to hear this. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. Thank you for your
Well,
work.
thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.